Alrighty, welcome back. We just talked about some of the rule changes coming to college football next year, possibly the helmet communications, the tablets on the sideline, and the 2 minute warning. Two of those I'm very excited about, one not so excited about, but I will live with. And then it's time for playoff discussions. It has been the hot topic for what feels like forever at this point, but it just got a little bit more interesting. It just got a little bit more of a hot topic in the recent weeks and in the recent days. As we know, we talked about last week the 14-team playoff that would take a very interesting structure. Three auto bids to the SEC in the Big Ten, two to the ACC in the Big 12, and then one to the Group of Five. And the wrinkle in all of that is the SEC and the Big Ten, whoever wins their conference championship will likely be the team that gets the buys, or will be the team that gets the buys in the current formatting. So, as you can imagine, the ACC and the Big 12 are not super happy with that. They don't think that's a remotely fair way to go about things. Obviously, the best two teams should get the buys no matter what, but it looks like that was the way that the SEC and the Big Ten were willing to compromise from four back down to three. And I think this is kind of just the next step on what has been happening in the sport for a very long time, but especially over the last couple of years, the SEC and the Big Ten have kind of just been stacking power and teams and everything that you could imagine to make them the biggest power brokers in college football. So that's what this has all been leading to. That's what all of this has been kind of coming to a head to, but it's here. I'll be honest. The SEC and the Big Ten are fully aware that they are the power brokers in college football right now. They are fully aware that where they go, college football goes, and they're fully aware that they play on a different level than a lot of these other conferences. And whether or not the gap is as big as they think it is, I tend to think they think it's a lot bigger than it is. But at the end of the day, they do have a lot of power. They do have a lot of big names. They have a ton of big teams. And they're wielding it. They're doing everything in their power to wield it. So I talked about last week, I didn't think the 14-team playoff will be the last iteration of the playoff we see. I feel even more confident about that today than I did a week ago. I think the SEC and the Big Ten have every idea of what they're doing. There is no confusion on their end. There is no hesitation on their end in a lot of ways. They have everything that they're doing is very calculated in my mind. Josh Pate talked about this on his show, where the SEC and the Big Ten have been building up so much power for so long that people have kept telling them that they are so above the sport, so much far above Big 12 and the ACC, and in a lot of cases they are. I'm not necessarily trying to disprove the idea that the SEC and the Big Ten play a higher level of football than others, but the more and more you tell those conferences that they are above everyone else and they're above the sport and they, run the sport in a lot of ways, the more they think, well, why do we run the sport through the NCAA then? Why do we use, the powers that be right now to run us if we are so far and above everyone else? Shouldn't we be governed a different way? And that's what they want to do. The SEC and the Big Ten have made really every indication that they have no intention of sticking around in the NCAA very longer. And I don't know how quickly this will happen. I don't know what's really, being said in all of these conversations. But I do know that the SEC came to the table, the SEC and the Big Ten, I should say, came to the table the first time with they wanted 4 auto bids each in a 12-team playoff. So they wanted 2/3 of the playoff. Then they decided they were going to come back and say, okay, we'll go down to 3, but we get the automatic buys in the 14-team. So in my eyes, the SEC has been approaching this and the Big Ten the same in a sense where we're just going to throw out all of the ideas that we have, all of the ideas that keep us up top, that keep us as the power brokers of the sport. And yeah, we'll throw a couple auto bids everyone else's direction. We'll throw them a bone every now and then. But at the end of the day, we want to be the teams that define the postseason in college football. And I think a lot of those proposals, a lot of the things that they've thrown out there, they knew weren't going to get approved. They knew they were going to make the ACC and the Big 12 mad. They knew they were going to create a lot of problems at that table when they brought forth both those ideas. But I don't think they really cared all that much, I'll be honest. I think the SEC and the Big 10 approached those conversations with the idea that they wanted to be their own thing. The idea that they didn't want to be under the umbrella of the NCAA anymore. They wanted to break off and be their own entity, which is, there's been some reports and rumors that has been bouncing around that room recently. And using that as a jumping off point, that the SEC and the Big Ten don't really want to be in the NCAA anymore. They don't really want to be affiliated with the rest of the sport in a lot of ways anymore. You look back at the offers that they brought to the table and you think, okay, so they had no intention of getting these passed, really. And that's I'm not to say, the SEC and the Big Ten were going totally grandiose over the top to make sure all of this happened, but they knew that when they came to the table with a 4-bid each 12-team playoff, teams weren't going to be happy. They knew when they came to the table with a auto bid into the bye week with their conference championships, they weren't going to be happy. So the SEC and the Big Ten were in full control of this situation, and they had very little care for what the rest of the conferences wanted. And I think it's something that Josh Pate talked about on his show, and something that I wish wasn't the case, but it seems that more and more it is the case. The SEC and the Big Ten just wanted to show up. They wanted to get in front of all these people, put out, 2 or 3 or 4 proposals, all of which, were massively slanted their direction, and they knew ACC and the Big 12 weren't going to agree to. They could get the Pac-12 to agree to essentially anything as long as they're involved, but those two in particular were never going to be happy about this, especially with the ACC kind of fighting for their lives right now. They were never going to be okay with this. They were never going to, be all hunky-dory and everyone was going to walk out holding hands and all of that. They knew that these proposals were a little ridiculous. They knew that these proposals were going to make some people mad. But they didn't necessarily care. Because the whole goal for the SEC and the Big Ten is to be the sport. I think we've seen that. There has been a onslaught after Texas and OU jumped to the SEC, and obviously this started well before that with the SEC taking A&M and Missouri, and the Big Ten taking Nebraska and all of that stuff. But once Texas and OU jumped to the SEC, the Big Ten felt the pressure to keep up, right? And they got 4 great teams from the Pac-12 in Oregon, Washington, USC, and UCLA. And then everyone else was kind of left to pick up the scraps at the end of the day. And as the SEC and Big Ten, continued their monopolizing of college football in a lot of ways, they started to see the writing on the wall that everyone was backing them. Everyone knew that they were the most powerful. And at the end of the day, if you are ESPN or if you're Fox or whatever, if you're one of those programs, you have no reason to really stop them necessarily. As much as, some people in that room that love college football for what it used to be and what it can be in the future if we don't go totally off the rails here, there's no real incentive for them to stop the SEC and the Big Ten, because at the end of the day, the SEC and the Big Ten are what make college football money in a lot of ways. They bring in the most money, they bring in the most viewership, so you would be hard pressed to find someone in an ESPN or a Fox position that has any desire to call out the SEC and the Big Ten on what they're doing and the effects it might have on the sport. But at the end of the day, it is having a negative effect on the sport. It's keeping what made the sport fun, which is everyone wakes up, that first day of spring practice or the first game day or whatever, knowing that they have at least somewhat of a shot. But the SEC and the Big Ten have no desire to give them that shot. So I think it leaves a lot of questions, obviously. I think the SEC and the Big Ten will be an NFC, AFC type model. And then the lower tier, quote unquote, lower tier teams will have to kind of figure out what their future looks like, because the SEC and the Big Ten are not going to worry about it. They do not much care what your future looks like. They care what theirs looks like. So very, very interesting situation. A lot of moving parts, a lot of infighting. I'm sure a lot of contentious conversations going on. But tons of questions that come out of all of this, mainly for the people left out, for the Big 12 and ACC teams that don't find their way to the SEC. How much TV money is left for those guys? How much are those companies willing to put on the table for two conferences that have either been possibly gutted by that time, because there's no indication necessarily that the SEC and the Big Ten are going to stop taking teams. So many teams want in, so you might as well take more power with the Florida States and the Clemsons and the North Carolinas of the world, which very interesting development in the North Carolina State, Duke, all that situation, which we will get into probably on tomorrow's show. But there's so many question marks for the quote-unquote lower tier teams. How much, talent is left after the schools that go to the SEC and Big Ten? How much do people actually want to play in the Big 12 or the ACC? How much do people not want to play in the big, NFL type setup that the SEC and the Big Ten are heading towards? And if all of that comes to play, if TV deals dry out, and if the talent runs low, and if a lot of teams are taken from your conference, and all of these things, what happens to these sports? There's not unlimited money in all of these athletic departments. We showed last week it's only about 30 of these that turn a profit. So if you cut even the media deal by 40%, a lot of these programs are going to be in trouble, because whether it's keeping up with recruiting or just staying on the field, being able to field a team, a lot of these things are going to happen. There's going to be teams that fold. There's going to be teams that don't think it's viable to have a football program. There's going to be teams that, just play every other sport. It's going to lead to a lot of very drastic changes. And all of this stuff is going to come at the expense of a really special part of the sport, which is the fact that anyone from Ohio to Ohio State, from South Alabama to Alabama, all of those people show up with, at least an idea that they are a part of a huge, important sport to a lot of people. And if the SEC and Big Ten break off, there is going to be less of that for the Sun Belt and the ACC. They won't necessarily be a part of the important part of the sport, which is insane for so many reasons. And I really hope it doesn't come to that, but we're kind of staring down the barrel of it. I'd be surprised if the Big Ten and the SEC didn't find a way to break off and find their own place. And I wish it wasn't the case, but it's going to be the case, I think. So it'll be a weird world we live in. The sport itself, I talked about it last week. The in-stadium atmospheres will still be there. The fandom will still be there. The hatred between teams will still be present. It's just, it won't be the sport that we all grew up and have been watching the last couple of years. So very weird. Tons of changes are going to come to this sport very quickly, and I I guess we'll look back in 2026 and see where we are, because right now it feels like we could be in a entirely different place with an entirely different structure, with multiple different leagues and just tons of things happening around the sport that aren't the sport in a lot of ways. But I'm going to be here to cover it all, because college football is one of those things that I'm going to love for the rest of my life. I can't quit it. There's no way. So no matter what happens with the sport, I still think we have a great product. I still think we have a great sport for so many reasons. It's just, you wish that the people up top making the decisions that will affect all of the fans and affect everything thought about the fans before they made decisions. But it's the world we live in. So we'll try to save as much as we can, but college football is going to be different here pretty soon. But let's get out of negativity world. We're going to be back here in a second with a Good Vibes Monday. We're going to talk about some guys that made some money this week. Always a good thing for some college guys coming out of the draft process to show out on Combine Day and possibly bank a little bit more in their bank account than they initially had thought. So let's talk about those right after this break. So stick with us and we will be right back.